If our United States government should succeed at chopping off my balls, figure of speech, of course, my creative motivation and my outspoken behavior, you'll know why. Time and time again, in my bid to try to become more authentic, more realistic, more true to life in my simulations, time and time again I come to the conclusion that this particular circuit idea of mine that I've been working over and chewing the fat over for the past over a half year now, after a year sabbatical of having already worked a former incarnation of it as my simulation of the Joseph Newman device, it's come to my conclusion several times that this cannot run a motor, and there's several different reasons. The latest one is I tested it. I put a load, a simple coil attached in parallel to the primary ballast and in parallel to the secondary ballast. And I chose a coil at first exactly the same as the transfer coil in this position, and the same as what would be comparable to this 10 Henry coil in the secondary ballast position, using the scheme of equivalent series resistance that I already make use of. Making, it's, I'll bring it up, making use of my installation of Paul Falstad's simulator in what I call the real simulator, real sim, which makes use of copper wire charts, resistance charts, to get an understanding about wire gauge and resistance in a coil. And I also used the information from the Joseph Newman coil as well, in combination with this information. And let's see if I can get an image of that. It's a much older image, so here it is. So this is the chart I got off the internet, and they're all about the same. If you look at them up, they give the same data. They just repeat each other. So for different gauges, you have different resistances, diameters. It's all very good poundage. It's all very good information to have. Copper magnet wire data. This is insulated wire. It's amazing the amount of information you can get on the internet. So, where was I? So it kills the over-unity the minute you give it a little bit of load. And then I tried reducing, because I thought it was a little too much to have an equal quantity of an inductor over here and here that's up here. Oh no, I did it equal to this one actually. Yeah, to the two coils of the transformer in the center. And even when I used 15%, which is about what the maximum regenerative braking capability of the RAV4 EV from 2002, when you engage the motor, in addition to the 4 generators, one in each wheel, when you combine everything, possibly leaving out the braking effect, because you get regenerative braking both with the brake, or even when you take your foot off the accelerator pedal, you start to regenerate just coasting. But when you apply the brakes, I think you get a little bit more. And then, of course, you have a button on the stick shift, so to speak, to engage the 4 generators in the wheels. And then there's an actual gear you gear into for engaging the motor, the twin AC motor, as a pair of generators. But the most you can get is 15%, and I think going downhill from 4,500 feet down to, I think it was 1,000 feet elevation, I only generated about 5% in actuality. I don't know where the 15% comes from, but I was liberal. I used a reduction for these two coils of 15%. You don't see them. They're imaginary. I won't show you the schematic. because it's the wrong way to do things. So I'm not going to show you the wrong way. I'm just going to talk about it. It still killed the overunity. It went down to femto values. It was amazing. So again, I had to depressingly accept the fact that this cannot run a motor. It has, whether it kills the overunity when it's operating under load or when it has no load and you're just trying to idle it to rotate a motor shaft at using, 20,000 hertz, and you got to scale 20,000 cycles per second, and you got to scale that down by using various methods. It's not an easy task to try to confront this. Now, there's an interesting twist to this, though. It's not all whining and complaining. There's some hope that there's some reality to this, because I believe in my heart that Tesla was consistent. He was not an inconsistent person. He was a Gemini, like me. And they are known to change their minds at the drop of a hat. But he did like to keep secrets. He was not a teacher. He was not a Steinmetz. He did not teach. He was not an Eric Dollard. Eric Dollard keeps a few secrets, but he's a teacher. He knows how to teach, and it's not easy. Tesla, not only did he not try to be a teacher, but he didn't want to be. He kept secrets to himself, proprietary possession of the inventor. And in order to do that, he had to spin yarns and stories. Now, he knew Peter Savo was a big mouth. He knew that. Let alone that Peter Savo was not his cousin or nephew or whatever. He was a big mouth, and he knew he would spread false rumors. So he started one. Tesla started the Pierce-Arrow demonstration of 1931 yarn as a tall tale. Well, not as a tall tale, as a... He changed the truth to hide the truth. Because he did do a demonstration, but it was before Peter was ever born, in 1897, according to Arthur Matthews. And it involved Tesla alone, not driving around the outskirts of Buffalo, but driving from New York to Buffalo, in a car powered by a single battery, the battery that's under the hood, the auxiliary battery. No other battery was used. Using so little juice that he wasn't even draining the battery to speak of. And to top it off, the guy was a obsessive compulsive efficiency freak, He took efficiency to the max, very much like the Germans. No wonder the Germans took a liking to him. Nobody else did. We're not efficiency-oriented. We're slobs. I have to admit it. Even today, in Tesla's day, even and in today's, it's only technology that disciplines us. If it wasn't for technology, we'd be slobs. And outside of technology, we're still slobs. Well, Tesla was no slob, and neither were the Nazis. And he drove efficiency to the max in his pursuit of perfection of his devices and concepts. And when it came to the Pierce-Arrow demonstration, it was no exception. You have to consider the time period of 1897 was the same time period he invented the UFO technology, and he scuttled around the skyline of New York City in his pot-belly stove, which for a man to fit into must have been very big and heavy. Yet he neutralized the inertia, and he went scuttling around in the airspace above New York City at night, outside his lab, and then come back into his lab. That was in the early 1890s. By the late 1890s, he adapted it to a car, a very heavy, over 4,000-pound Pierce-Arrow. Now, I thought he was using the iron chassis, because William Lyne talks about that. He may have been, but he didn't have to. It may simply have been the weight. He wanted to prove to himself that he could apply it to a car, his UFO technology to a car, a very heavy car, and whisk along at 94 miles an hour, according to Arthur Matthews. And then to take efficiency even further, this was the point I was trying to get to, and I forgot. He went ahead and modified the design of the battery. He threw out the lead-acid battery, and he replaced it with a primary battery. Now, a dry cell battery is a special case term for a generic term, it's a subset of a superset. The superset is primary battery, namely, it's non-rechargeable. What we call non-rechargeable technically is called primary battery. And Tesla went and made the zinc plates of his primary battery replaceable so efficiently that he could store a year's supply of plates in his car, in the car, for driving, for normal driving. And one set of plates could take him 500 miles. And it would take a matter of minutes. A child could replace them in a matter of minutes. They were very safe. The zinc got eaten up. He wrote a letter. The newenergy.com website, nuenergy.com website. N is in Nancy, U is in Underwood, nuenergy, newenergy.com, no, .org website. They've got a letter that Tesla wrote to a manufacturer about his zinc, I believe it was the zinc battery technology, because he says the problem with batteries is the cathode gets eaten away. Nothing happens to the anode. The anode accretes precipitate upon itself. It does the opposite, while the negative pole, the cathode, eats itself up alive. I'm sorry about all these noises I'm trying to do here. I got the wire out of the way here. So he decided, why not replace them, Why? And so he devised a system to do just that. And he didn't have to. This is the point I'm making. He didn't have to. His composition of design parameters was so good. Who cares? But he took it to the max. So we have this car. I'm sorry, this wire is making all these sounds. I can hear it making noises. I don't know what it's rubbing against my shirt. Here, I'm going to have to hold it up with one hand. It's very annoying. I'm sure it's annoying to you, if you can hear it. Let me check to see that I have sound. I hate to talk and find out I didn't talk. Hello. Yes, I have sound. Okay. All right. Do we have sound? Do we have sound? All right. So he spun this yarn for Peter's benefit, knowing that Peter would spread it around and spread a lie. Half a lie is a lie, because we still am convinced that the version that Peter spread around is not the truth. And it's not. It's not to say he didn't do something, though. See? But he knew human psychology. And sure enough, to this day, to Wikipedia's credit, they call it the Tesla electric car hoax. Spawned not by Tesla, oh no, but by Peter Savo. Peter Savo, what did he know? He was an innocent lamb, part of Tesla's schemes to keep secrets, because he never patented it. You would have heard of it, I'm sure, because it was part of his UFO technology. He just wanted to see if he could apply it to cars. Think about it. If you neutralize the inertia of a 4,000-pound car, over 4,000 pounds, FDR drove around in one. It was a luxury car to no end. If you can neutralize the inertia, how much energy does it take to move it forward? You could blow backwards and make it roll forward if it were not for the friction of the wheels upon the road and the axle and the drive shaft. Even if you put it in neutral, there's enough friction. Blowing won't be enough. But if you could get it off the ground and neutralize its inertia as well, blowing alone, a breeze could blow it around and knock it against a building, a 4,000-pound mass, although it won't have 4,000 pounds when it hits the building. It'll be like a leaf. No, it'll be like the feather of a birdie, a bird's feather. The building won't even feel it. Unlike the jet planes who went into the 9/11 buildings, they won't even feel it. Anyway, so if you neutralize inertia, it really is a considerable savings of energy to move a car around. Big time. So this is what I think happened. This is what his thinking was, his line of reasoning. Now, The reason why I think this power supply is no good for a motor, I've already stated, for several reasons. It'll be difficult to turn the motor shaft, and you'll kill the over-unity the minute you apply a load of any size, no matter what the size. And I've even tried putting in current sources. That's another way to test to see whether or not you can apply a load to a device. And that killed it too, but I did that like over 6 months ago and I gave up. It was very disconcerting. Anyway, so when you have a shorted motor, under light load conditions, according to Jim Murray in his little talk about his transformational generator, his transforming generator, you will always, and he stressed it, he repeated it himself a few times, always get over unity. But it's common sense knowledge among those who build motors. If you short a motor, this is what's going to happen under light load conditions. But this is the nature of the power supply of a UFO because there are no moving parts. It does not rotate anything, nor does it need to. Now, William Lyne, in his Occult Ether Physics book and in his Pentagon Aliens, gives us his summation of how he doesn't say what the power supply is, but how the power is used to create, movement, neutralization of inertia and movement. And I have to agree with what little I can imagine, using speculation alone, partly to what he says. I don't think it's as complicated as he makes it out to be. I don't think you have to apply AC to the rear end to neutralize the DC tube of force that you're traveling through, that you formed in front of you, that you're moving into as you move forward in that direction, whatever forward happens to be. And a UFO can be any direction. But in the case of a car, it's just forwards. I think all you have to do is just create the tube of force. Now, what is this tube of force? Well, he quotes J.J. Thomson, I believe, and when J.J. Thomson used it, it's really equivalent to what Eric Dollard calls lines of dielectric force, which are not tubes per se. They're kind of thin to be a tube, certainly not even a straw. If you can think of how wide is a quantum, then quanta, then that's probably how wide the tube is. So I wouldn't call it a tube. Struck conceptually fine, it's hollow, like a tube, but it ain't very wide, even if it is hollow. So I was trying to think of myself, well, if you create a force in front of you to move yourself forward into, it's going to have to be wide enough to consume the whole vehicle, and plus a little extra around the edges for safe measure. So it ends up becoming like a tube, the way we think of a tube, something macroscopic we can see, in terms of size, at any rate, conceptually envision, maybe not see. What creates such a big tube if the fundamental basis of a dielectric line of force is thinner than the hair on a baby's head, far thinner? Well, a parabolic dish. A parabolic dish wide enough to create the right size beam diameter in front of the craft. But what kind of energy? Well, William Lyne said it was DC. Now, let's go back to Edwin Gray. Marvin Cole was the original worker. He created an anti-gravity levitation device, little to his knowledge. He thought he was creating a motor, and yet it hadn't reached the stage of a motor to turn a shaft. He was just dealing with a prototype of popping discs and making them fly up into the sky using pulse DC. And as he developed it further, he still didn't get to the motor stage, I believe, according to Mark McKay, if I understand correctly. He simply was popping discs and whatnot and made it more sophisticated. And at one point, the whole device started to levitate. And then he left town and took all his documentation and his girlfriend with him and left the builds behind. And when Edwin Gray hired Richard Hackenberger, a classically, formally trained electrical engineer with a physics background, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I could be stretching it, but he was formally trained. He took one look at the device and couldn't understand what Marvin Cole was trying to do. He turned it into a high-efficiency motor. He's responsible for the Edwin Gray motor. Courtesy of the help that Marvin Cole provided, what little help Richard Hackenberger could make sense out of it, it was Richard Hackenberger's design that made the motor nearly 300 coefficient to 1, according to the Bing Crosby Foundation Research Institute, who tested the motor and found it to be around 294 or whatever coefficient to 1, coefficient of performance. That's really cool, coming from a formally trained engineer, electrical engineer. But it was Marvin Cole who made it levitate, and it was not a motor. He was not rotating anything yet. He was just popping coils. So we have to look at it in that context. He was not rotating anything. This is very important. But Marvin Cole managed to do it. And what was he doing? He was using pulsed DC. Now, I've got another design, and I won't show it to you. I'm not going to bother, because I want to stay focused. But it's in my book. And I do mention how to create DC out of this in order to get rid of the negative power factor. Well, I shouldn't call it that. To get rid of the separation between the half AC cycle separation between current and voltage, to make it almost go away. Not by reducing the frequency or changing the frequency, but by eliminating it altogether, by converting it with a full bridge rectifier into DC. And it's done with pulses, because there are gaps in between each pulse, and each pulse is a flat-lined, fairly square wave, and so squished together, each of the square waves, that you can barely see the break between them. And so for all intents and purposes, it's a flat-line DC. Yet it's not. It's pulsed, and it's got a few microsecond size gaps between each pulse. And the flathead top, the mesa of each pulse, is quite wide. So the proportional duration between the time that the DC pulse is on at the top of the square wave versus 80% off before it rises again, it never reaches zero. It just goes down to around 20% voltage and then goes back up again to 100 of whatever it was doing. I think it's around 100 or 500 volts, I forget which. If you do it in volt mode, you can do it in current mode, in which all the voltage is zero practically and all the voltage is up. No, all the current is up and all the voltage is down to zero, or you can reverse it. You can do either mode. I believe it's voltage, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So Marvin Cole was probably using pulse DC, and I can do the same thing with my device. So it's already pointing in the direction of a possibility of a power supply for a UFO. So what I envision is a parabolic dish. At first I thought insulated on the outside, an aluminum. See, now we get into Tesla's trimetal generator. An aluminum parabolic dish. And I suspect it's insulated on the inside, according to his patent on radiant energy. You had to insulate the panel, the metal panel that you raise up off the ground to absorb radiant energy. Well, what if you do it in reverse? You're not receiving, you're projecting. Hello? Tesla hid a lot of stuff in his patents. We'll never know, probably, all the secrets he hid, all the clues, all the clues. And that's probably one of them. You have to turn it around. It was not receiving radiant energy, it was projecting it. And it wasn't radiant energy, it was just DC pulsed in order to move a UFO craft. This was his way of patenting a UFO empowerment system. It already had the power supply in some other patents somewhere, if he got around to it. But the actual methodology for levitation, I think, was couched inside this radiant energy patent, hidden away in plain sight. So if you get a parabolic dish insulated on the inside at the very least, possibly on the outside as well, but most importantly on the inside, and then you have another reverse, much smaller parabolic dish at the foci of the larger one pointing back in, then you can maximize all your energy, because I'm trying to think just like Tesla, be obsessed about efficiency. Because if you put an emitting device, emitting some kind of energy out at the foci, you can lose half of it going out the front end of the parabolic dish, and it's not going to be focused. It's going to be wasted. It's going to radiate in all directions. Only half of it's going to go into the parabolic dish and get focused into a point to be bounced back outwards. So I have envisioned two parabolic dishes, one inside the other. The small one, the baby one, points into the much larger mama one, And that way you don't waste any energy put out by your emitter. Now the emitter, would imagine, is a toroidal coil. And the axis of that coil is pointing forward out of the parabolic dish, as well as into the trough or peak, if you want to call it, of the parabolic dish. The center, the axle of the parabolic dish, where the axle meets the peak or trough of that parabolic dish. That way, it's at right angles. The excuse me, the plane of the toroidal coil is at right angles to the axis of orientation that you want to send this energy out to. Now, what energy is it? Well, I thought electromagnetic is short range, so it better be electrostatic. And that would concur with the choice of aluminum for your parabolic dish. Otherwise, you'd use copper if it were electromagnetic. But if we're going to deal with voltages such as the electromotive force, it better be aluminum to be highly reflective of that voltage. Because that's what, I forget the guy's name. He was an English guy in the 50s, used. He made a, when you create a balsa wood little model plane, you create an armature out of balsa wood, and it's mostly hollow space. And then using glue, you put this paper cover around it to make it look like an airplane, your model plane build. My brother would do it, and I kind of watch him as he did it, and different stages of development. And that's how this guy built an aluminum foil UFO-shaped disc that he rotated simply using a gasoline engine on a shaft. It was not affixed. It was simply resting into the shaft, and once it got spun fast enough, it just took off. It just flew up, left the motor behind, and rotated on its own and increased its rotation speed and just took off into the sky, never to be seen again. And it was lightweight, though. So I would imagine then, if I can remember what a point I was trying to get to, that the parabolic dish is an aluminum shell to help facilitate this interaction with the electrostatic force, the dielectric force. But that doesn't mean that the craft has to be aluminum. See, I was erroneously considering over the past 6 months that the craft itself has to be aluminum and you dump the energy into the craft. But then, if I have to consider the possibility that the Arthur Matthews story is valid, the Peter Savo story is a hoax or a yarn, and that this free energy device that you see before you, the power supply is only good for a UFO and not much else, then I have to consider the possibility that iron has nothing to do with it. The vessel can be made of anything you want. It can be made out of shark's teeth. It can be made out of sandstone. It can be made out of limestone, basalt, you name it. It can be made out of jello. I don't care. Just so long as it's there. And your parabolic dish, though, does matter what material of construction it is made of. So that takes care. Here's the power supply, and there's my speculation of what it would take to create a DC pulse tube of force pointing forward that you move your craft into. And the neutralization will take care of itself. Why? I'll tell you why. Because Mother Nature is surrounded. It runs on AC. The whole of nature runs on AC. She doesn't run on DC. That's a man-made fiction. Yet gets around certain problems, like how do you levitate? Now, it may not be a fiction. It could be that at the center of the Earth, we actually have DC pulses taking place to cause the empty shell of the Earth to float around and above and away from the core. So the core is there, then there's emptiness, and then there's the shell of the Earth. And how do you buoy it up away from the center? Well, you've got to create an anti-gravity effect. And you have to spin it to create what do you call it? What are those tops you spin? Inertial reference. You have to create a gyroscopic inertia to help hold the shell together, in addition to the forces that are inside the Earth. Together, the two forces help create and maintain the curvature of the Earth, and it's a very tender balance. It wouldn't take much to throw it off balance and just the Earth would crumble. Let's not go there. It already happened. We got the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, so let's not go there. We don't want to destroy the planet. So this is my theory about levitation. It is a DC pulse phenomenon, so it's not, strictly speaking, a fiction, but it's a rarity in in Mother Nature's universe. Most of Mother Nature's universe is AC, and this is the quadrature, the four-pole that Eric Dollard talks about, that Tesla invented, and Steinmetz went and changed it into three-phase. But Mother Nature runs on four phases, the quadrature, and let's see, where was I? And so there's no need to neutralize the DC line of force. William Lyne makes an assumption that you have to apply AC at the rear of the craft in order to neutralize the DC tube of force that you're traveling through, so that you don't leave any behind that would pull you back. Well, trust me, it's going to dissipate as soon as you create it, so you better move as fast as you can. You never see you do see a UFO travel slowly, and you know what they do? They wobble. At least the older versions, they would wobble, because they're not holding up very well, because they're moving slowly. It's not because the power supply is less. That is true too. But it's because the forces they are applying to move about are too weak to maintain their stability of inertia, of neutralization of inertia. So of course they're going to wobble. They're going to precess due to whatever forces there are operating inside the craft that start to dominate. But once you fully neutralize inertia, they can't wobble. And that's the only reason why they wobble, and the only reason why there's no need to have an AC neutralization at the rear of the craft to get rid of the DC tube of force. Because electrodynamics is a temporal relationship. It's our relationship with time that makes electricity possible. It's only there so long as you keep it up. It's not like a rock that just sits there, because it's not chemistry. Just because it's hosted by a circuit doesn't mean we have to mix it up and confuse it, that it's the same as a lump of plutonium or a log or a candle wax. It has no material substance whatsoever of itself. It is purely temporal. Its existence is in time. Remember, Dollard said the three ingredients of electricity, and time is one. He never mentioned matter. Unlike Joseph Newman, who wanted to get into the gyroscopic particles of the copper wire, Eric stays out of that. He says time is the nature of electricity, not the matter of space. The matter of space is merely a meeting ground where the two other ingredients of electricity can meet, unite, and make it happen in time. The dielectric force and magnetism in time. So it's time that is the medium in which electricity exists. And Eric Dollard is bringing that out in the latest book that Aaron Murakami helped him publish on Amazon, in which he talks about you have to do away with the three Cartesian coordinate dimensions of space entirely. It just gets in your way and creates confusion and havoc. And everything is based on time, the dimensionality of time alone, with various dimensions to it, to give reality to electricity, because that's the only way you can think about electricity, is in terms of time. You have to get rid of the space that our material existence has forced us to qualify everything in terms of, because it has nothing to do with electricity. Electricity is far more refined and subtle than spatial phenomenon. It transcends space. And this is something else we have to understand, that time is not a fourth dimension tacked on to space as a last thought. It is penultimate. It is ultimate. It is transcendental to space. Time transcends space. There is no question of it. I knew that as a 5-year-old. I was born with this knowledge. That's why I take to this so readily after only a few years of letting a simulator train me along with Eric Dollard's theories, along with a few other people, mostly Eric Dollard, because it's already innate in me. I just had to bring it out. And the simulator challenged me to bring it out because I was a dummy, and I still am a dummy, but it helped challenge me in no uncertain terms, because simulators are robots. They don't lie unless they're told to lie. And apart from what they're told to do, usually the high price spreads do not lie. They cannot afford to and charge over $4,500 for microcap and get away with it. Excuse me while I do something here. Okay, so getting back to the subject matter. There. So here's the power supply, and I have a link here, is.gd/Heaviside Ferranti schematic. And then the screenshot of this is simply without the schematic, is.gd/Heaviside Ferranti. And then I have another one, do the math, is.gd/do the math. And that refers to, if I can find it, this. I had to do the math in order to figure out what was going on in the transformer, because I usually don't do the math. I let the simulator take care of the math, and I just play dumb. But this time I had to do the math, and the math was simple Ohm's law, and that's the only law I know, and believe me, trust me, I do not want to know any other law of electrodynamic theory. Ohm's law is good enough for me. If I can get by on that, I'm doing fine. And I am doing pretty good on just that alone. But trust me, it wasn't until recently I managed to, oh yeah, now I get it. Ohm's law, right. Because this was one of my major problems when I tried to take electrodynamic theory 101 in college 40 years, almost 40 years ago. I had trouble with Ohm's law. It made no sense to me. So, even though I have this innate soul memory that dates back millennia, God knows how many, it doesn't mean I want to take to it, because it's so abstract. You can't bite into it like a cookie, and taste the sweet taste of the cookie. There's nothing there to taste. Anyway, so in order to figure out what was happening in the transformer, and it's important because the transformer is what's different in this version, in this flavor of this power supply than any other that I've done, is I put in an actual transformer component from that microcap provides. Now, trust me, this capacitor here doesn't do much for itself. It's a servant. If you look at the energy level in here, it's like nothing. But it boosts both sides of this transformer big time. So it's very worthwhile to put it in as a kind of a look-alike short, but of course it's not a short because we got insulation in between the two plates, so it's not a short to the two sides of the transformer. It actually boosts the power on either side of this transformer. Now, getting back to, so I had to do, the funny thing about transformers and simulators, they don't tell you what goes on in there. You can't scope it. You can scope just about every other component. You can even scope the spark gap, get in there, and all the, the Thevenin or the Norton equivalent to a spark gap is a whole bunch of different components. It's another whole circuit in itself, the model for a spark gap. And you can go scope all those components of that spark gap, that equivalent circuit of a spark gap, the model for a spark gap. But a transformer, you can't. There's nothing there. So I had to use Ohm's law to figure out what energy was happening in the transformer, because I want to know what my output is, and I want to know what my input is. If I don't know that, then I'm not a happy camper. Now, it's easy enough to know the input because there's only one. It's the sine wave generator, 20,000 hertz, 3 volts. So what do I choose to make the output? Well, I choose to specify, to assume that the output is this transformer here. That's where the action is. Okay, so what is it? Well, I don't know. Let's use Ohm's law. So I had to do all this math to come to the conclusion that the transformer is putting out 48.5 amps. Despite the fact that it's putting out 64.5 teravolts. Do you know what a tera is? A tera comes after a giga comes after a mega comes after 1,000, and 1,000 comes after 1. That's a lot of place values to the left of the decimal point. So that's what I determined. It was putting out, wait, what was the wattage? Wattage. 440 gigawatts. That was the wattage. The impedance was 188 mega ohms. But see, I didn't realize that's impedance. I looked at it in terms of ratio. And I guess that's another way to look at it, a ratio of efficiency between volts and amps. You see, in the RAV4EV, the ratio between volts and amps is about 1.67 to 1. Because it runs on, regardless of what the battery pack voltage is dropping to, the circuitry boosts it and maintains it at around 345 volts, delivers that to the twin AC motor at a roughly 206 amps if you're accelerating full throttle, although initially it's 210, but if you're cruising, it's 50 amps. Meanwhile, the voltage is still 345 volts. So I did a rough calculation. At full throttle acceleration, you divide 345 volts by 206 amps, and you get about 1.67 ratio. I didn't realize that's also impedance. Now I see, oh, that's impedance. So you do the math, you learn something. So it shows the impedance is low, which is good, efficient. It won't overheat too much, but it does overheat a little. It has a water cooling system and a pump to pump the water around to cool the twin motors. So in my device, I've got the impedance way up high, and I couldn't bring it down. I'm sorry. I just couldn't. I tried. 188 mega ohms of impedance. That's a very hot motor. What can I do? Well, at least it's not rotating. I don't know. What can I say? What else? So that was the impedance. The wattage was in the gigawatt range. So I had to do all that math to figure this out. And I made a lot of assumptions, which are probably slightly off, if not very much off. But I had to make a few assumptions because I left out frequency when I computed the primary side, and then I had to estimate what the secondary side was without any use of frequency, because I know frequency is part of this, but I left it out. I assumed it was DC, no frequency, and of course that's a lie. So I don't know what the actual numbers are. These numbers are going to be skewed in the wrong direction. I simply said, okay, well, the inductance here is 50 million times less than the inductance over here, so I'll just multiply the voltage by 50, because this is a step-up transformer from primary to secondary, and divide the amps by 50 million, and I'll get the 64.5 teravolts and the 6.8.5 milliamps on the secondary side, and I'll leave it at that. I don't know. What do I know? And then I'll assume, well, let's see, the square root of 50 million is 7,071 winding ratio, and you have to have a minimum of 2 windings on the smaller of 2 coils, so you'll have to double this, 14,142 windings on the secondary side. So, it's not too bad. It could be worse. I've heard of worse. So I did the math to try to figure out the energy level. So this schematic, the shortcut is is.gd/do the math. What else do I have to show you? I think I've told you everything I need to tell you. And this video is very long. I used to call it something else. I haven't uploaded it yet, but when I do, I'm going to make this the shortcut. Vimeo.com/Vinyasi/UFO talk. Earlier in this video I said motor talk, but it's not a motor. Whoops. So it's now UFO talk. Over 4 hours. I have no idea how long it may be 5 hours by now. What else? Oh, yes. Good news. I was able to eliminate all of the equivalent series resistance of all, plus I eliminated one of the capacitors, and then I brought it back in a new location. But I eliminated all of the equivalent series resistance of all of the capacitors. And that was just mind-blowing. And I did it by simplifying the circuit, amazingly, As it is, I'm not even so sure I need the spark gap ballast, 1 ohm. I'm afraid to take it away, quite frankly. I know I need it here because the simulator is going to give me error messages saying that it's a closed loop, a shorted loop, a shorted inductor. They don't like that. So rather than use a ridiculously low figure for this resistor, making believe it's not there, I thought to myself, nah, I'll leave it in 1 ohm resistor. And likewise, I left in the spark gap ballast resistor as well, because previously I needed it. And so I just, it's kind of like, a pitcher, playing, about to pitch a game. He's on the mound. This is baseball, right? So what does he do? He wiggles his cap. He spits in the earth. He looks to the right. Well, of course he looks to the right. Looks to the left, whatever. Looks at the catcher up front. But he does different things that are purely habitual and are ritual, similar to squeezing a rabbit's foot. So I leave it there like my rabbit's foot. I don't want to mess with it, But I managed to reduce these voltage coils down to 1 Henry, and their wire gauge I reduced to 30. Meanwhile, these current coils up here, along with this transfer coil, are all 10 gauge wire. So that's pretty good, 10 gauge and 30 gauge. Anybody can build something with gauge wire like that. So I was hoping to try to keep this as realistic as possible. And then all well, not all, but 2 of the 3 capacitors, this one here and this one here, is 1 millifarad. And as for my model for equivalent series resistance of 10 milliohms, I used a ceramic capacitor, even though it's got to be high voltage, because this damn thing is going to have a ton of voltage going through it. So I don't know what capacitor you end up using. It'll be fine, whatever you use. Now this capacitor, I realized it had nodal points of efficiency. When you changed the capacitance by factors of 10, I would come into and out of, and there were slight variations. Really, they didn't amount to anything too much, but you can't go above, at least by factors of 10, you can't go above 1 millifarad. Because if you go to 10 millifarads, the whole thing craps out on you. So you have to be 1 millifarad or less. Now, I don't know if there's a lower boundary, but there's certainly an upper boundary. And I found that, oh no, it doesn't crap out at above 3, negative 3. It craps out at 1, I believe. Right, 1 e to the negative 1. That's 100 millifarads. I think it craps out at 100 millifarads. Anyway, somewhere around in there, because 2 was another nodal point, I remember now. 1 e to the negative 2 and 1 e to the negative 4, but 4 was better. So I kept it at 1 e to the negative 4, so that's 100 microfarads. For this capacitor, this boosting capacitor, which has like nano, values of current and voltage, when it's running, it's really silly, but it really does a lot of good. Even though it doesn't store the energy, boy does it boost it just shoots it right back in here and boosts the power gain really nicely. Now I think that's everything that I want to relate. That I don't want to repeat because this is a very long video. I've already covered a lot of stuff in the prior segments of this compositional video. So this is what started out as my Heaviside correction or Heaviside solution to the Ferranti problem, to the Ferranti effect. And I think I did a pretty good job, all things considered. It's not what I expected, it's not going to turn a motor shaft, but hey, if it can make a pure Serro go forward on the power of 1 little battery and 1 tiny little motor, I wouldn't be surprised if Tesla didn't use a starter motor, an electric starter motor, to run that car forward at 94 miles an hour with no inertia, He probably used a starter motor. Or the alternator. He probably took out the gasoline engine but kept the alternator in there and used that as his propulsion device to move it forward. And he could have used it to recharge the battery, but maybe that would have ruined the over-unity circuits, so maybe that's why he had to come up with a replaceable zinc plate primary battery, because he could not recharge the battery, because that would have ruined his circuit. Because you can't put it, it's like, you can't put anything else in here, it messes it up. It's like, John Worley Keeley, if I am saying his name correctly, that was the problem he had. You know, you can't mess with over unity unless you're John Bedini, and or an Eric Dollard. You can figure things out, or a Jim Murray, because you're an electrical engineer, and you can figure these things out. I'm not, and so once I find a circuit that creates over unity, I can't mess with it. If I make any changes, I lose the over unity because I don't know how to make the changes and still stay within the realm of over unity, the magic of over unity. It's very easy to crush it. It's very easy for it to go away. It's much harder to acquire that, and much easier for it to go away, either to explode or to go into hibernation. So that's why I think a UFO power supply is the only safe way to use this thing, because you're not adding anything to the circuit, such as a mechanical load or an electrical load. So it's not a generator and it's not a motor. It's neither. I thought it was both, but it's neither. neither, and or. It's simply a source of a lot of energy, a tremendous amount of energy that we have to figure out what to do with it. Unlike the conservative, formally classically trained electrical engineer or physicist will say, "What's it good for?" Because they have been brainwashed to think it's a waste of time to put any attention on it. And I know in my heart that's not true. So I've been guided by my heart and my own stupidity and ignorance, and that's the only way I've been able to make any kind of gain whatsoever, is because I'm stupid and ignorant on this topic. And because of that stupidity, I can make these assumptions. Otherwise, I couldn't make them, could I? My intellect in the back of my head, or in the front of my head, actually, would be telling me, "You can't do that. You're doing it all wrong." That was a criticism I used to get years ago. "You're doing it all wrong. You got to do it this way. You can't do it that way. You're doing it all wrong." Oh, it's so funny. As if there's a right way to do anything when it comes to circuits. Oh, my God. Unbelievable. I love that one. It tickles me to no end just to remind myself over and over again, "You're doing it all wrong." I'll leave you one last little anecdote. Charlie Lutz used to tell this story, not later on when I knew him when I got older, but when I was a teenager and first went to his lectures, he would say, he was giving advanced lectures for transcendental meditation, and so to meditators only. And so he once gave this anecdote. He was vice president of Flint Co., which is a construction firm. They would do jobs like the Cloverleaf interchanges between the Hollywood freeway and some other freeway in downtown LA. He knew exactly how much concrete went in there because he supplied all the concrete and the rebar to the various construction companies in charge of building that Cloverleaf interchange. It's a massive Cloverleaf. You can look it up on Wikipedia or wherever. It's like got 4 different interchanges, and they all loop-de-loop, and it's a tremendous amount of concrete and rebar. Anyway, he used to have this joke, he would say, that at one point he was changing a light bulb, of all things, at one of the construction sites, because he would go there, and do some of the work. He wasn't an armchair guy. He got involved whenever possible, fraternized with the construction crew. He could communicate with anyone. That was one of his lessons of life, was to learn how to communicate with anyone, and he was capable of doing that. Me? Good luck. Anyway, so he's changing a light bulb. And the company had various vice presidents. He may not have been vice president yet when this event happened that I, telling you about. But be that as it may, there were more than one vice president, right? You have one president, you have multiple vice presidents, usually in a corporation. And so one vice president would come in and say, "Charlie, you're doing it all wrong. Here, let me show you. You got to do it this way." "Oh, okay, I didn't know." And so now he's doing it a different way. And then another vice president comes in, "Charlie, no, you're doing it all wrong." Not knowing what the first vice president had said to Charlie, he's telling him something completely different, maybe even opposite or totally, And after a few times of that, he didn't know what to do. I don't know what he did. Quite frankly, I can't remember. So that reminds me, it's like, people can be that way, You're doing it all wrong. You got to do it this way. And everybody's got their own notion of how to do it, I just wanted to leave you with that because it's an important thought to keep in mind. There is no right way when it comes to mathematics. You either get success, the light bulb lights up, or you don't. Or it explodes in your face and shatters into a million shards. You want a light bulb that lights up, right? That's all that matters. There's no right way. Unless you're worried about, I don't know, what the neighbors may think, you know. My mom was, oh, damn it, I'm getting into another story. My mother was afraid of what I did in the privacy of our home. What will the neighbors think? Mom, who's going to tell them? You know? I had a girlfriend, a playmate, when I was 4 or 5 years old. And I wanted to play Don Juan with her, not doctor. I was beyond that. I didn't need to play doctor because, you know, I was born clairvoyant. I could remember these things. And all of a sudden, I remembered the birds and the bees. So at the age of 5, I didn't exactly want to remember that. So it was a burden to me. See, to me, knowledge is a burden. That's why I talk so much. It's a burden. I'm sorry. I know too much. It's a burden. So I recalled what it's like to be a woman in a woman's body and what it feels like, for that matter. And so I knew all there was to know about sex, so I wanted to play Don Juan with her. And all she could think of was, what if Daddy finds out? Well, who's going to tell him? You know, we're having a nap in my grandmother's home. Who's going to tell him? Oh, God. I'm sorry. Now I'll shut up.